Thanks, Len. And I would also love to acknowledge the land itself, where we are, and all those wonderful elders who, in conjunction with the spirits and the land, created the law. And I'd like to talk to you about law later on. And I'd like to acknowledge some of my favourite people in the audience and elders like Jim Berg and others who are here. I'm in awe of you lot coming out in your lunch hour, you know, to listen to a bloke from King Island. But I'm proud of my heritage, all my heritage. We've got a lot of Cornish in our heritage, but we have Aboriginal family from both sides, from Moonta in South Australia to Lockhart River in Queensland. And in searching for all those strands of the family, I came across a history that I frankly couldn't believe. The people that I was asking, particularly people in Western Victoria and later Far East Gippsland, were insulted by my ignorance, and they had every right to be insulted by my ignorance, because I believed a child's history of Australia. Not even and most 8-year-olds, when confronted by the story that we perpetrate as the history of Australia, would laugh, unless they've been to school, in which case they become inundated with this unbelievable story of invasion into Australia, which we still argue is settlement. Even a fortnight ago in Victoria, we were on radio, we had people ringing up to say it wasn't an invasion, it was a settlement. The history actually speaks against that profoundly. So for me to be able to talk about this in front of a scientific audience, in front of my own people, in front of my old friends, my family, I feel like a bit of a fraud, except that when I came across some of the facts in the explorers' diaries, my temperature rose incredibly to think that for 220 years we could believe that this was the case. This picture here is of Goongerah, Mount Goongerah, and Goongerah is the possum, but these are in fact some of the eggs of the rainbow serpent, because the rainbow serpent left Queensland, travelled all the way down the Great Dividing Range, and from there went across Victoria, South Australia, and that serpent's head rests on Rottnest Island now, according to the belief of many Aboriginal people. It has a parallel journey of the whale right down the east coast over to Western Australia and to Albany. I understand there's an Aboriginal woman from Albany in the audience, and I have a question for you, which I want to talk about later on. But this is not a child's story. You know, these are obviously rocks, but for Aboriginal people, they represent something. Spiritual representations around the world have been enormously powerful. Spiritual representations are currently causing Syrians to massacre each other. All around the world, if you go to the great art galleries, the great churches, the great castles in the world, anywhere in the world, choose a continent, you will see a trail of blood. You will see that those cultures are founded on war. the amazing thing in this country is that in this spirituality, this religion, and I took my daughter through it on Saturday and Sunday last week with my grandson, who's that high, 6, and suffers from autism. We went through part of Yuin culture, or virtually the entire 7 chapters of Yuin culture on the top of Mount Gulaga, and later on the Sunday through the part of the whale ceremony, which is why I'm mentioning snakes and whales. And I was watching my family very, very closely because I wanted them to absorb as much of it as they could, because in a modern world you don't get many weekends when you can have your daughter and your grandson and some good mates around you. And I made a point of talking about with them that Saturday night, and I said, this is a profound religious experience, spiritual experience that you have undertaken. I want you to remember that today you did not see a weapon. You did not see a gloating of having conquered an enemy or taken someone's land, because Aboriginal culture does not revere that as an act of a human. I think it's very important for the world to consider a culture where the taking of another group's land has never been considered, or if it was considered, it was controlled by law. This is an incredible philosophy, and I acknowledge those old people who, with the power of their intellect alone, with the power of their love of land, of the mother, they created a philosophy which refused to indulge in war. War is not the natural condition of man. And in Australia we proved that. So to throw up your hands and say, we can't do anything about the conflicts around the world, we can't do anything about Hiroshima, we can't do anything about the dumping of nuclear waste on YPY lands in South Australia today, we can't do anything about the destruction of the Burrup Peninsula art, the greatest coherent and large-scale spiritual development on Earth, for the sake of a gas terminal that might be useful for 15 years until the gas runs out. If we say we can't do anything about that, well, we deserve our fate. And I'm pleased to talk to you people today because you're in a position to do something about that. No pressure. When I began looking at what my elders had warned me was a fraud about Aboriginal culture and economy, I came across this map in a research document by researchers like yourselves, and it takes the evidence of a scientist, archaeologist called Norman Tyndale. You may have heard of Tyndale before. Tyndale went around Australia and documented all the evidence he could of where Aboriginal people had been harvesting grain. And he did this, oh sorry, wrong one. He did this all around the country and found a great grain belt. The other interesting thing about it is that he was an American. Lorandos, who did such a lot of work on Aboriginal archaeologists, was an Italian. The only man who has helped Aboriginal people harvest some of our grains and turn it into bread is Japanese. There is a line running through this examination of our country which should be embarrassing. It's about time Australians started to examine their history and their science. When Tyndale produced this evidence, he was about to take up another position in Australia, but instead he was laughed out of the country by his fellow archaeologists who thought that he was gilding the lily of Aboriginal achievement. The current Australian wheat belt is here, and here, and here Aboriginal people were growing and harvesting grain, 4 times the size. Here, Charles Sturt was looking for the inland sea, and so convinced was he that there was an inland sea, he took a whaleboat with him. It was excess baggage. There was no inland sea. But in crossing these sand dunes in this area here, a pool died, the doctor, horses died, all people in the party were complaining of scurvy, some of them were blind, and they crossed one last sand dune here. Their horses were almost exhausted, could only stumble down that sand dune in a straight line, and they were greeted by 400 Aboriginal people who were growing grain in the ephemeral stream bed of the Warburton River. Sturt was given water, and the Aboriginal people turned the coolamons of water around to beasts they'd never seen, the horses. They recognised them as being thirsty and gave them water. Those people, those gracious people, then gave Sturt and his party roast duck and cake in what we now call, what we like to call, the dead heart of Australia. These people were growing grain, had an excellent, healthy life, and had built several new houses, not because they were waiting for Sturt to arrive, but because they were extending their village, which probably had in it 600 or 700 people. And those houses accommodated Sturt and his party while they recovered their health. And at night, this is terribly scientific now, so I hope you've got your notebooks out. As evening fell, Sturt would sit out the front of his hut and write, and we were very thankful that he was such a prolific writer and drawer, because that's evidence for us. And he said that as evening fell, he loved to listen to the people singing and laughing, children playing and dogs barking. But behind all of that cheerful noise was a sound, and that sound was as people ground grain into flour. He said it was mesmerising, the lifestyle that these people had, and as the meals were finished, he could hear women putting children to bed, and by 10 o'clock at night, the whole village was silent. Our people were considered by the colonists to be barely human, and reading that evidence of our culture, really, if you're not moved by that, and if you're not moved by the fact that those people were murdered shortly afterwards, then you have indeed a very hard heart. And you also, as well as being moved by it, you have to do something. You have to respond intellectually. Why did this happen? But why does the absence mean something to us today? I'm very grateful for that American. It's rare for me to be grateful to Americans, but you know, they have some of the world's greatest writers. This is amazing about this continent, where you can get Donald Trump trying to be the president, but I would say that of my favourite 20 writers, 14 or 15 of them are American. They're filmmakers, Coen brothers and people like that. It's an extraordinary culture, but at its very heart, there's a rotten apple, and that's the gun laws and why they still operate today. The gun laws were gun laws because of American Indians. Very, very attractive pair of hands. This is at Mildura, and we're grinding panicum decompositum into flour. And the ladies who made that wonderful film, whose name I cannot remember, about Lady Mungo, this is an amazing film and it tells you the growth of science in Australia. There's one of the archaeologists who actually uncovered Lady Mungo, put her in a suitcase and took her to Melbourne. And this is an incredibly important skeleton because it shows how old the civilisation is here. But for Aboriginal people, that was desecration of their grandmother. This wasn't just a scientific exhibit. This was someone's great-grandmother. And when asked, in a later stage of Australia's development, about 7 years ago, why he didn't consult Aboriginal people, because now it's fashionable to consult Aboriginal people, and we have to make it more than fashionable. Tony Abbott whinged about welcome to country as being hollow. Well, we have to make it not hollow. We have to wait for it and want it in our country, because it's about loving the land. It's not about listening to an Aboriginal person going through the motions, because they're not going through the motions. They're talking about our land, our shared land. 2 facts of Australian history. Non-Aboriginal people are not going to leave. Aboriginal people are not going to leave. It's what we do with those 2 facts which will determine what kind of country we end up having. But those ladies who made that film and took that scientist to task so graciously and so thoroughly and so scientifically were here while their children harvested this grain, turned it into flour and made these solar ovens. Bit of science for you. Cornflake packets and beer cartons and silver foil baked the bread that we had on the sand dunes of Lake Mungo. And that's the bread. It smelt like if you walk out into a pasture in February on a 40-degree day around dusk, that's what it smelt like. And it was a triumph. It was incredibly moving for those ladies, for the kids, for the old men, and for all the other people there, most of whom were scientists. This was a very important day in Australia's history, and we're investigating these grains now. It's not just this kind of grain. We've got rice. We've got all sorts of grain. We estimated last year there was something like 85 grains that we thought we could recognise that Aboriginal people had used. It's now at least 120, and someone told me about one yesterday that I hadn't even heard of, hadn't even suspected. So this is the start of a real Australian agriculture, because many of these grains, and decompositum is one of them, grows on sand, needs one watering only. That's why those people in Central Australia were using the stream bed, because they sowed directly into the damp soil. They didn't need fertiliser because they were looking after the condition of the soil. And this is the threshold of a new agriculture in Australia, in a country where water shortage is going to get worse. You know, Aboriginal people are really quaint because we see a river and we assume that it would be good if there was water in it. Whereas a farmer in the Sunraysia of Australia sees a river and wants to take it all out. And that's why the Murray-Darling Basin is in such desperate straits. It is one of the most shocking acts of betrayal of the land, and it's also betrayal of our brothers and sisters in Adelaide, that we refuse to give them fresh water, our countrymen, our countrywomen. It's crazy. All for the sake of desperately trying to grow European foods when we have these. And I think one of the reasons why we never wanted to consider Aboriginal foods, because it reminded us of the war. Because if we recognised the Aboriginal economy, we'd also have to recognise that the dispossession was illegal. Bill Gamage, who wrote The Biggest Estate on Earth, sent me this photograph of a painting. It was sent to him by an art gallery owner who'd read Bill's book, and he pointed out this is very early on in Victoria's contact history. It's said that these are the first cattle coming into Kangatong behind Healesville. What the gallery owner noticed, oh look, I've done it again. Thank God I can write. This is, he noticed this area here, and it's yam daisy. So this is what parts of Victoria looked like prior to the advent of cattle. Very important photograph of a painting. This is that plant, yam daisy. This is the tuber. That's the parent tuber. That's bushrat. These are out of my garden, and we're plagued by bushrats come out of the swamp to eat our yam. They'll walk past strawberries and passion fruit to do it. That tells you about the plant. You know, why are they so fanatical about getting at this plant? It's 7 times as nutritious as a potato. It's, I hope Beth Gott's not in the audience. No, thanks, Beth. Because she always takes me to task on this. I've got to try and get it right. It's not fructose in there, it's fructans. Is that right? Throw something if I'm wrong, but fructans, which is very kind to people with diabetes. It's not even a sugar, but look, you can see I'm out of my depth, can't you? Beth tells me it's fructans. I believe her, and so do the bushrats. This is a very superior food, and this is why so much labour was expended by Aboriginal people to grow and harvest this plant. Now, if you go through Colac, moccasin capital of the world, as the people from Apollo Bay say, should you decide to go through Colac, and it's not advisable after dark, you'll drive down Murray Street, and Murray Street is named after Hugh Murray. Now, after shooting the first half dozen Aboriginal people he came across, as you do, you're on a journey, you've got to get somewhere, don't want to be held up. Hugh Murray came to the shores of Lake Colac, and there he found a net belonging probably to the people who were behind him, laying down on the ground now. And he took the net and the fish that were in it. It was a tiny little sardine-type fish, a smelt. And that fish doesn't exist anymore because of the pollution in the lakes around that area, because in the early days, the effluent from the dairy factories went straight into the lake and poisoned it, along with the effluent from the town. Aboriginal people were absolutely shocked when they realised that Europeans were defecating into the Yarra. Just astounded that you would think of defecating in your water source. They had a few more shocks coming, but that was the first thing they noticed. But Murray stole that net, stole the fish, and he left a mirror about that big and some beads. Fair trade. So the relationship went backwards from that point. And when he came back the next day, the mirror and the beads were still there. They'd been moved, they'd been handled, but they'd been left because they were of no use. But the thing that Murray noticed, and he wrote a journal, so we're grateful for that. He noticed that the whole of the plains had been devoted to a plant. He didn't know what it was called, but it was a yam. But there was also moth orchid and bulbine lily growing across those plains, and they were growing through moss, this bed of moss. And like Bill Gamage said, there were no trees on the best soil in Australia, the best volcanic soil in Australia. It had no trees, but it was covered in these plants. And Murray's sheep ate through these plants virtually overnight. They just ate their way through the Western District. And what Murray noticed the next year was that once the moss had gone, that the dew stopped. There was a microclimate above these plants, and once the moss had gone, the dew stopped. The sheep compacted the ground, the soil hardened, because prior to that, he said, and this is reported many, many times, and it's in this excellent book, Dark Emu, that you could run your hands through the soil. Now, when I first read that, I found it hard to believe, because there are virtually no soils in Australia where you can do that. So what had happened? This plant is interacting with the soil. What we're noticing about it in our gardens is if it's been there for 2 or 3 years, the soil improves. It doesn't get worse. It actually gets more friable than it was before. There's something going on between the plant and the soil. And, you know, the association with microbes in the soil. And I've got a mate down at Genoa, which is actually Gino, which means foot, which means it doesn't mean, it's not named after the foot, it's named after what the foot does, the journey. And we're on a song line that goes up to Mount Kosciuszko. And anyway, another story. I'm talking about this lady who does the science on, she uses the bricks method to analyse these things, and we've been analysing the change to our soil. When my son was 6, he never thought he could play football better than me. He thought I was the best footballer at Apollo Bay. He was quite seriously wrong, but he liked to compete with me in everything. He's currently on a mission to take more wickets for Apollo Bay than I took, and he's got enough time to do it. But he grew this, what I believe is probably the biggest field of murnong, or yam, in Australia at the moment. You get a bit of a gauge of scale by the pumpkin here, but this extends a bit further than I've shown. You know, we're very hopeful that this coming spring we'll have a much greater resource than that. But I'm very proud to show you that photo of my son's yam field. You know, it's a bit of history, as well as a bit of science, as well as a bit of agriculture. He's currently in Nepal, And at 5,700 feet, and with no phone contact, we kept on hearing about people dying on Everest. Fantastic week for us. This is the Brewarrina fish traps. This fish no longer exists because when Europeans came to Brewarrina and noticed these fish traps, they wanted to dam the river. So they did that, and this fish disappeared from our earth there and then because it bred up the very top of the Darling River. And the fish traps had been designed in such a way that they could withstand flood. There was a locking system using a keystone rock, which we still don't know much about. We've done so little research on these traps, which some scientists say are the oldest human construction on Earth. And this, see how quickly I said that? The oldest human construction on Earth? If this was in Texas, there'd be 35 Greyhound buses going there every half hour to look at it. Think of Angkor Wat. Think of the Grand Canyon. Think of the pyramids. The pyramids are so old. They're 2,000 years old, you know. All our graduate archaeologists go over there, even today, when in Australia we've got an unexamined system here, which we believe is 45,000 years old and represents, if not the oldest, then one of the oldest human constructions on Earth. And Australia can't bear to examine it, can't bear to think about it. This is where Mitchell was riding through and saw, he rode through 9 miles of stooped grain. When he examined big clay and straw vats, they were full of flour because people were catering for these fishermen and fisherwomen. The whole system had been designed so that ponds were dedicated to particular groups of people, particular families. But there was a gap in the river system, a gap in the traps, so that these fish could go upstream, not just to where they were spawned, but to neighbours that the people at Brewarrina would never see, neighbours who spoke a different language. But the law said that this water had to be able to reach, these fish had to reach people in a land that they would probably never visit. It's called egalitarianism, terribly unpopular at the moment. We're supposed to scoff at equality. We're currently, debating whether 7-Eleven and places like that should be punished for paying kids next to nothing. Now, there's a wonderful book called Gunya, Guri and something or other else by an Australian archaeologist, Menmot. And in it he has examples of Australian Aboriginal housing. When I was at school and university, we were asked to think about Aboriginal housing as a bit of bark on a stick. And examples of housing in Menmot's book come from all over the country. This is just one of them, but I like it because it comes from North Queensland, near where a branch of our family live. And the old people up there, only a matter of years ago, were telling me what the... Brucey boy, cut it out. Were telling me where they got these from. These are vines, with very flexible vines that they could use to make houses. And it's also a good example because it's the same building after it's finished with clay and straw render. Very comfortable dwelling. And this should break your heart. This is a cemetery, and I only found this plate recently, but you know, oh dear. You know, drawn kind of romantically, but there's really no romance about it. This is a place that has been groomed in reverence of the dead. And all the archaeologists around the world, all the Europeans, say that some of the indications of civilization, house building, farming, domestication of plants and reverence for the dead. And I use these examples in Dark Emu because all of them are evidence of the intense spirituality and humanity of Aboriginal people. These pottery, they're made out of gypsum. They're the caps that the women wore in mourning. At the end of the mourning period, the gypsum caps go in here. And it's very serene. This is one of these stone houses at Budgebim, where the Tirandara, uncovered after the fires in 2009, and shows the foundation of a house. Once again, George Augustus Robinson tells us that these houses had clay and straw roofs, and they were strong enough to ride a horse over, because we all want to ride horses over our neighbours' houses. So they have to be strong, so a European can sit astride a horse on top. It tells you about the attitude, to this town. But at the beginning of this year, we had a Black and Bright festival put on by the Wheelers Centre, fabulous organisation, and very, very helpful to Aboriginal people. But they took me for a photograph into the State Library, and the librarian there, the bloke in charge of the old books, said, "Oh, do you want to have a look at a couple?" And so I chose Sturt's journal. And that was, I'd heard about this picture, I'd never seen it. Everything here has been trimmed. All the trees have been marked, because once again, we're in a cemetery. This wonderful, serene location for reverence of the dead. And I was incredibly moved by that, because I wasn't just looking at one example of this type of construction, but there were so many of them. There were also, I saw different versions of the houses from the interior, and then I saw this great ellipse here. You can see its scale when you consider the size of everything around it. This is quite a massive building. It's of a design suited to its climate, and it's representative of some of the things that were around Sydney at the time that Philip arrived. Here's this wonderful old book behind here. I'm a book person. I love old books, but these old books from this wonderful European culture that we belong to, because we do belong to it, has no mention of Australian Aboriginal people, and yet this is what our life was like on this land, and that's why we acknowledge the land. And it's tragic to think that we've ignored the evidence of science on this land for so long. But it's a wonderful time to be an Australian. I can't think of a better time to be an Australian scientist. True. There's a great future in front of us, but when we start considering the use of these plants, like the grains, like the tubers, and the other fruits and vegetables that Aboriginal people used, I hope we remember who domesticated those plants so that Aboriginal people are not dispossessed twice. Because these things are going to be useful in a deteriorating climate. And they're going to be useful in a deteriorating diet, because most of those grains are gluten-free, and Beth Gott will tell you about the qualities of the yam daisy and how healthy it is to eat that. What we will be eating commercially produced yam and breads from our flours within 5 years. They will sell it initially in boutique markets, like down at Collingwood, at Sarie's and all that place, where it is law for everyone to wear a long scarf. European culture is incredibly specific about how you must wear, what you must wear when you live in Fitzroy. Good Lord. There's the book you can't get. But next week,